love you too much, no, it's fame, fake, or even hate. Don't be scared if the weight paralyzes your state at the gate. No, it's a lot to take in, it's designed to know when, don't wait. Don't be scared when the weight paralyzes your state at the gate.
Our partners, the World Economic Forum and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. This board has been urgently convened by the World Economic Forum.
There are 200 epidemic events every year. The number is increasing, driven by globalization, climate change. Dr. Mike Ryan, the executive director at WHO and the head of WHO's emergency program.
This is a new normal. The Epidemic Readiness Accelerator, which is a project of the World Economic Forum in partnership with many, including WHO. Stakeholders consist of product manufacturers and UN partners, including ourselves. A global data ecosystem aims to build a collaboration of big data networks.
It began in healthy-looking pigs. A new coronavirus, mild flu-like signs to severe pneumonia, with more than 30,000 cases and nearly 2,000 deaths.
It will be a severe pandemic. This news story that just aired on Global News Network.
There are now more than 30,000 reported cases.
CAPS is a novel coronavirus. The cumulative number of cases is doubling every week, unless we find a way to interrupt transmission. The fatality rate is about 10%, 2 to 4 times more lethal than the 1918 influenza pandemic.
And by medical countermeasures, we mean vaccines, drugs. I know we would all agree that if we had a vaccine in hand for CAPS, it'd be a game changer. But leading vaccine experts say a vaccine in the near term is highly unlikely.
We simply cannot rely on these old timelines and processes.
A majority of Americans expect a vaccine to be available within 2 months, and 65% of those polled are eager to take the vaccine, even if it's experimental.
Vaccines.
It's highly unlikely that a vaccine could be developed, tested, manufactured, and distributed in less than a year. The antiviral drug Extranavir has demonstrated some efficacy against the CAPS virus, but does not prevent infection like a vaccine would. Experts agree that while many lives will be saved by this antiviral, it is not going to slow the pandemic in the same way a vaccine could. Still others are recommending that suppliers, buyers, and countries entrust a central international entity.
We do have some models vaccine.
That we can actually produce an Ebola vaccine in a year. It requires flexibility on the regulatory side. So having a centralized mechanism.
The supply of vaccines, antivirals, etc. But unless we do that whilst doing what we can do on vaccine, I agree, we will have this get out of control.
The World Bank to low and middle income countries in which they can repurpose those loans for these types of emergencies.
A centralized command and control, centralized approach.
I fully support the centralized approach, and it should be centralized.
The United Nations fits the bill.
Centralized. CEPI, which was established 3 years ago to accelerate vaccines. A coronavirus is, in fact, one of its indications and first areas of focus.
A centralized convening body.
A global coordination.
Overall, our all-in case fatality rate is somewhere in the order of 7% to 10%.
We need to have some kind of international mechanism for the UN as being sort of the base of operations, ensuring that states are actually doing what the larger plan needs to be.
Most of this production would already be committed in contracts. Vaccine.
The increasing rhetoric who are saying that globalism is responsible for this pandemic. The business, health, and scientific communities need to combat that rising rhetoric and misleading information.
On various social media channels and cable networks, there's been some conspiracy theories. Trust in pharmaceuticals and government is very important.
We will conclude this meeting.
The scenario now advances 3 weeks.
There is a good deal of underreporting due to lack of surveillance, and in 3 months there could be as many as 20 million cases and 1.6 million deaths.
Politicians are adding to the noise and confusion through social media.
Global GDP could fall an additional 4%, such a severe recession, creating the groundwork for national instability and change in the global political landscape.
There's a real need to make sure that the newsrooms have the right information. And how can we get the right information disseminated rather than hearsay on social media?
CDCs, WHOs, departments of health.
Have government bailouts of companies?
Where there should be some government incentive. If there's some sense that there's a UN institution that can do all of this, then I worry we're suffering from a delusional disorder. Decentralized, but has a collective responsibility and accountability. And that needs to be supported by the public leadership.
So government leaders.
Yes.
I agree with that 100%.
An organization like the United Nations can be of help.
Ride this out.
Communicating valid and trusted information.
Google, Facebook, the free-to-air media networks, ensuring that they are equipped. People believe much more something that will come from their company than they will believe something that comes from government.
And this concludes this meeting.
We now pick up this scenario 3 weeks later.
30 million cases and 3 million deaths.
First up is economist Dave Gamble.
We literally cannot afford a heavy-handed response that suffocates our economy. Some cities will have suffered more from our interventions than from caps.
Is Dr. Gamble wrong?
Protect every life we can. Funding shortfalls are putting lives at risk and extending this devastating crisis.
Again, we seem to agree.
As a physician, I am comfortable saying that our health response to caps cannot afford to wait for an incredibly complex debate about what sounds to me like history's most expensive economic bailout.
25% fall in GDP at the 2-year point. Without bailouts for national economies, economic failure in the most desperate countries could lead to collapse of national governments, which could further exacerbate the caps pandemic. This would require a huge and unprecedented mobilization of funds.
Another option would be to use funds for pandemic response to give to companies that are doing work directly related to the response, either in the making of vaccines.
Unless we bring this pandemic under control, at the end of the day, the question of the economy is redundant. The question of the economy is redundant.
Borrowing in the near term may buffer in the longer term.
We got enough fund to develop a new kind of vaccine for H1N1. So with the 89 days, centralized and coordinated effort.
Centralized in the UN system?
And look for extra ways to financially commit to this endeavor that we're on to find a vaccine.
For the most part, it's really a war footing that we need to be on.
We have to use the international measures that we have, like the World Bank and the IMF.
And if this is the rolling new normal, sometimes delaying spread so you can actually keep confidence in your institutions and keep your economy moving, albeit at a sluggish rate, will be a really important part of the agenda, I think.
The UN agencies are now calling for the establishment of a pandemic-related trust fund.
A month ago, we predicted there might be another 1 million cases. That came true. And you know, the companies that will be our best partners of this are the companies who have been thinking about this ahead of time. Help work through public-private partnerships to support companies, but not all companies.
The investor community is not discerning properly from misinformation and disinformation.
Limit is bringing manufacturers and distributors together. Henry Schein's part of it, BD, Johnson & Johnson, 3M.
Actually increasing some of our focus on the cutting edge science and research and development, trying to accelerate that 1 year to a vaccine.
Close this meeting and reconvene as needed.
Now advance 3 weeks to the 4th and final meeting.
And models estimate that we could have more than 12 million cases and close to 1 million deaths by mid-January.
Twitter and Facebook are reporting they've identified and deleted a disturbing number of accounts dedicated to spreading disinformation.
A recent riot highlights the real danger in these posts.
Countries need to make strong efforts to manage both mis- and disinformation. And experts agree that new disinformation campaigns are being generated every day. This is a huge problem that's going to keep us from ending the pandemic. If the solution means controlling and reducing access to information, I think it's the right choice. News organisations, public health groups and companies need to help people take the right actions to protect themselves.
Dis and misinformation are wreaking havoc on the CAPS response. Pharmaceutical companies are being accused of introducing the CAPS virus so they can make money on drugs and vaccines. Mis and disinformation are ubiquitous. So interruptions to these platforms could curb the spread of misinformation. Health ministries around the world are attempting to combat mis and disinformation, false and misleading information. National governments are considering or have already implemented a range of interventions to combat misinformation. Others are censoring websites and social media content. Penalties have been put in place for spreading harmful falsehoods, including arrests, promoting fact-checking efforts.
How much control of information should there be? And by whom?
So there is work that's being done to actually create algorithms to sift through information on these kind of social media platforms. The Gates Foundation and others are funding organisations to work on things like this.
To make sure that we have the right representatives on traditional media networks in order to portray our side of the story. Misinformation.
Tap faith-based organizations to recruit them also.
During H1N1, WHO filled the parking lot in Geneva with the global press and provided them daily updates on what was happening. Very clear about communicating what is absolutely wrong. The daily briefing from, in this case, I can't imagine any other institution than WHO.
The local community organizations helping to discern the truth from the misinformation.
The social media platforms, there's an opportunity to understand who it is that's susceptible in what form to misinformation. So I think there's an opportunity to collect data, receiving reports about people trying treatments that are purported to be effective but are actually harmful.
We are doing clinical trials in new antiretrovirals and in fact in vaccines, and social media, including Facebook, is actually enhancing recruitment.
Flood the zone, in a sense, with a trusted source.
There needs to be a centralized response around the communications approach. There needs to be a central repository of data, facts, and key messages.
Even before this began, the anti-vaccine movement was very strong. As we do the research to come up with the right vaccines, how do we get the right information out there? How do we communicate the right information to ensure that the public has trust in these vaccines that we're creating? How do we communicate with those governments to ensure that misinformation and disinformation is not being spread?
I agree on the point on having a centralized source of information, and I think the WHO in this instance might be that.
Think about what we know about incentivizing the kind of behaviours we want to see, how we incentivize them to manage their behaviours.
So can we turn the survivors into an effective community-based source of accurate information?
A step up from the part of the governments on enforcement actions against fake news, right?
Find your trusted interlocutors that are capable of saying this is not acceptable, this is in fact the truth, here's the information, to see that they can bring things down that are in fact lies or false information. A national source, an international source, other trusted sources, and really guiding everybody towards that information is one of the most effective ways to deal with a situation like that.
UN, WHO. The UN and WHO, but when they challenge governments directly, they often get into this issue of sovereignty. Soft power influence, influentials who can call up the head of state, powerful constituencies within those countries, more stealth entry points rather than trying to punish them through the international health regulations.
The champion for TB in South Africa was Nando's Chicken. Strong voice that's economically differentiated for their governments as well in their country. They're going to listen to them with some respect.
How did this pandemic turn out?
Was catastrophic. 65 million people died in the first 18 months. The GDP down 11%. The world saw large-scale protests and in some places riots. This led to violent crackdowns in some countries and even martial law. The public lost trust in their respective administrations. Several governments fell, while others were desperately striving to hold on to power. This spurred further crackdowns. Attempts to control media messaging, originally aimed only at health-related misinformation, became used increasingly to quash political dissent. The societal impacts, the loss of faith in government, the distrust of news, and the breakdown of social cohesion, are there things we could have done in the 5 to 10 years leading up to the pandemic? The answer is yes.
What should we do to prevent this from becoming a reality? The WHO's existing influenza vaccine virtual stockpile is a good model that could be expanded and augment WHO's ability to distribute vaccines. Countries that would have to support this effort through the provision of additional funding to WHO. The World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, regional development banks, national governments, and foundations should explore ways to increase the availability of funds. Governments in the private sector should assign a greater priority to developing methods to combat mis and disinformation. Governments will need to partner with traditional and social media. Media companies, we believe, should commit to ensuring that authoritative messages are prioritized and really false messages are suppressed.
So I chair a body called CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. We are investing in the development of vaccines in the neglected and space, for example, MERS vaccines of this kind, the coronavirus.
How do we centralize that information?
Including military, are they ready for such civil unrest if it were really to get out of hand?
We believe that the World Economic Forum is a great platform that brought together post-Ebola, a great group of the WHO, the World Food Program, led by Henry Schein, J&J, and
on behalf of our partners at the World Economic Forum and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, I want to thank our players again for their participation and insights today.